In a world where power collides with truth and arrogance meets dignity, one thing becomes clear: the stories that matter aren't always told. Here, we bring them to life. The moments when leaders rise, when voices of justice shatter silence, when history pivots on a single choice. This isn't just news. It's storytelling with heart, drama, and purpose. If you believe in truth over noise, dignity over arrogance, and leadership that inspires instead of divides, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and join a movement where every story reminds us who we are and who we can become. The cameras were rolling, the lights unrelenting, and millions of eyes were fixed on the broadcast when it happened. Donald Trump, a man who built his brand on dominance and bluster, leaned forward at the podium, his face tightening with barely contained rage. His voice, normally booming with rehearsed bravado, cracked under the pressure of the moment. Viewers across the world watched in disbelief as the former president, so often in control of the stage, lost his composure live on air. It was not a slip of the tongue, not a minor gaffe. It was the eruption of a man unprepared for the truth that had just been laid bare. The truth came not from a rival politician, nor from a seasoned American commentator. It came from the calm, steady words of Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader from Burkina Faso. With quiet dignity, Traoré spoke not with anger but with conviction. He didn't shout, he didn't gloat. Instead, he delivered a truth so piercing, so unfiltered, that it cut through the noise like a blade. And as his words echoed across the broadcast, Trump's reaction told the world everything. Here was a man undone not by power, but by principle. Social media ignited instantly. Clips of Trump's loss of control raced across platforms. Memes, hashtags, and commentary flooded timelines. Some called it the unraveling of arrogance. Others called it the moment America was forced to confront a voice it had tried to ignore. And yet, beyond the frenzy, one question burned brighter than the rest. What exactly did Traoré say that rattled Trump so deeply? Because this wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a collision of worlds. One clinging to a past built on dominance and spectacle, the other rising from a continent demanding dignity, justice, and recognition. For viewers, it was more than political theater. It felt like history itself had taken the stage. The storm was only beginning. Commentators scrambled, allies whispered, and critics sharpened their knives. But as the dust settled around that unforgettable moment, one truth was undeniable. Something had shifted. Trump's fury wasn't just personal. It was a tremor of a narrative crumbling under the weight of exposure. But the question is, what exactly did Traoré reveal that shook Trump to his core? The moment may have looked like a simple debate exchange, another tense soundbite in a political world addicted to drama. But the stakes ran much deeper. This was not just about words traded on live television. This was about history colliding with the present, about power meeting resistance, about arrogance facing dignity head-on. To understand why Trump's outburst mattered so much, we need to rewind and see what led these two men to the same stage at the same moment, under the same unforgiving spotlight. For years, Donald Trump has carried with him a history that cannot be separated from his politics. His rhetoric on immigrants, particularly from Africa, has been some of the most polarizing in modern memory. He branded entire nations as undesirable, cast doubt on the value of diversity, and painted immigrants not as contributors to the American story, but as threats to it. Time and again, his words created dividing lines between us and them, between those deemed worthy and those dismissed. To his supporters, it was bold talk. To his critics, it was open contempt. And to millions watching around the world, it was a reminder of just how fragile dignity could be when faced with unchecked arrogance. Enter Ibrahim Traoré. Barely in his mid-30s, he rose to prominence in Burkina Faso as a figure of defiance, youth, and unapologetic truth. Unlike older leaders burdened by decades of compromise, Traoré carried himself with a clear-eyed conviction of someone unafraid to challenge the status quo. His speeches were simple but powerful, rooted not in theatrics but in lived reality. He spoke of Africa not as a continent begging for handouts, but as a land of strength, resilience, and unclaimed potential. In him, many saw a symbol of a new generation, fearless, unbowed, unwilling to accept disrespect. So when these two men found themselves facing each other in the glare of international cameras, it was more than coincidence. It was inevitability. Trump, representing an old guard of bluster and division. Traoré, embodying a rising call for justice and recognition. Their exchange wasn't merely about policy or diplomacy. It was about something more elemental: respect. Who gives it, who denies it, and who demands it when it is withheld. For the audience, both in the studio and watching around the world, the energy was electric. Trump's base expected dominance, the familiar show of force he had wielded countless times before. But Traoré was not the kind of man to fold under pressure. Every calm word he delivered carried the weight of a generation tired of being diminished. And with each passing second, viewers felt the shift. Trump's control slipping, Traoré's presence rising. It was a battle fought not with volume, but with values. Trump leaned on the old playbook of insult and interruption. Traoré countered with composure, his restraint speaking louder than any shouted remark ever could. And therein lay the tension, an unstoppable force of bluster meeting an immovable wall of dignity. The clash was not just personal, it was symbolic. For millions of immigrants who had felt dismissed, for African communities who had long endured stereotypes, this was more than political theater. It was vindication, a moment when dignity refused to bow, when arrogance met its match. And yet, even as the debate swirled in real time, viewers could sense that the confrontation was only the surface of something much larger. The true weight of this moment would only be clear once we looked closer, not just at the words exchanged, but at the men themselves. But to understand why this moment cut so deep, we need to look at who these men really are. To understand the weight of Trump's unraveling moment, we must step back and trace the path that brought him here. Because Donald Trump's story has never simply been about politics. It has been about power, image, and a relentless performance of dominance. From the gilded towers that bore his name to the reality TV stage that turned him into a household brand, Trump cultivated an identity not of service, but a spectacle. He wanted the world to see him as unshakable, untouchable, larger than life. Yet behind the flashing lights and booming rhetoric lay a pattern of arrogance, insecurity, and contradictions that would eventually collide with the quiet defiance of a man half his age. Trump's history with Africa is not a hidden chapter. It is an open wound. His infamous remarks dismissing African nations as shithole countries sparked outrage across the globe. In one sentence, he reduced entire peoples, cultures, and histories into a caricature of disdain. Leaders across Africa condemned the remarks. Immigrants felt the sting of dismissal. Even allies struggled to defend him. Yet Trump, unrepentant, brushed it off, portraying himself as a man unafraid of political correctness. In his telling, it was honesty. In reality, it was contempt. And this contempt became a cornerstone of his brand, speaking not to uplift but to belittle. But it wasn't only his words about Africa. Over the years, Trump positioned himself as a champion of strength, projecting bravado at every turn. He declared himself the deal maker, the strong man, the only one capable of commanding respect on the world stage. Yet time and again, cracks showed through performance. His infamous feud with journalists revealed a man rattled by questions. His uneasy encounters with seasoned world leaders often left him grasping for the kind of dominance that could not be staged. Behind the bluster, there was always a flash of insecurity. The need to be seen as powerful, masking the fear of being exposed as ordinary. Consider the contradictions. Trump would boast about loving America's allies, yet berate them in public forums. He would proclaim his respect for military strength, yet mock veterans and families who bore the scars of service. He claimed to be a master of truth, yet bent reality into whatever shape suited his momentary needs. These contradictions were not slips. They were features of his persona. He was a man who thrived on chaos, drawing energy from division, treating politics less like governance and more like a televised contest where ratings mattered most. And while his supporters cheered the bravado, the rest of the world watched with unease. For African nations in particular, his dismissals carried a familiar echo of colonial arrogance. The idea that power flowed in only one direction, that dignity could be dictated from afar. Trump embodied that old arrogance, the kind that treated others not as equals but as pawns on a global chessboard. And so, when he entered a stage where an African leader stood ready to answer back, the weight of his history followed him. What made Trump's story all the more dramatic was the contrast between his controlled environments and those he could not bend to his will. On reality television, he was the unquestioned star. In campaign rallies, he commanded adoring crowds. But in debates, interviews, and live confrontations with those who refused to cower, his mask often slipped. The moments when he was challenged were the moments when his insecurities burst through, anger flaring, composure cracking, the performance faltering. And here lay the paradox. Trump thrived on appearing invincible, but his invincibility was only as strong as the silence of those he belittled. When challenged by those willing to stand firm, his greatest weakness emerged. He was not a man at ease with dignity. He was a man who demanded deference. And when that deference was denied, his control unraveled. This was the backdrop to his confrontation with Ibrahim Traoré. By the time they faced each other, Trump had built a global reputation defined as much by his controversies as his policies. He was a former president who sparked outrage with his words, divided nations with his rhetoric, and never backed down even when proven wrong. But he was also the man whose performance depended on submission, whose bluster could not withstand equal defiance. The stage was set for a clash not just of personalities, but of worlds, one clinging to an outdated vision of dominance, the other embodying a rising demand for respect. And so, when Trump lashed out on live air, it was not merely a spontaneous outburst. It was a culmination of years of arrogance meeting a wall it could not move. The words he once used to dismiss others now came back as echoes of his own undoing. His history of belittling, his contradictions, his insecurities, all of it converged in that single explosive moment. But across the ocean, a very different kind of leader was rising. To understand why Ibrahim Traoré's calm defiance on that stage resonated so deeply, we must journey back to the soil that shaped him. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in West Africa, is often painted by outsiders through the lens of struggle, poverty, instability, and foreign interference. But for those who live and breathe its red earth, it is also a land of resilience, of communities bound by tradition, and of a people who know the weight of dignity. It was here that Traoré was born, not into wealth or privilege, but into the ordinary struggles of a nation that had long been overlooked. From a young age, Traoré understood that survival was never guaranteed. His family, like many others, carried the scars of colonial legacies and political upheavals. And yet, what defined him was not despair, but discipline. Drawn to the military, he embraced its demands not as a ladder to power, but as a calling to protect. The uniform he wore was more than fabric. It was a promise to his people that their dignity would not be trampled without resistance. For Traoré, the military was not a stage for personal ambition. It was a crucible that forged resilience, loyalty, and sacrifice. His rise through the ranks was marked by humility and grit. Unlike leaders who sought the limelight, Traoré moved with quiet determination. He earned respect not by demanding it, but by standing shoulder to shoulder with those under his command. In the field, he shared the same rations, endured the same exhaustion, and faced the same dangers. His men saw not just a superior officer, but a brother. And in a nation weary of leaders who ruled from palaces while their people suffered, that authenticity mattered. What made Traoré remarkable was not simply his military discipline. It was the values he carried within him. He spoke of unity at a time when division threatened to tear his country apart. He embodied dignity when foreign powers treated his homeland as a chessboard for their own interests. And he stood for resistance against injustice in a world where smaller nations were expected to bow quietly to larger ones. In Traoré, Burkinabe youth saw not just a leader, but a mirror of their own frustrations and hopes. He was their defiance given form, their pride carried into battle. When he stepped into leadership, it was not through a calculated political climb, but through circumstance and courage. At a moment when Burkina Faso was besieged by violence and betrayal, when trust in the establishment had eroded, Traoré's presence offered something different. He was young, unpolished by elite politics, and unafraid to confront uncomfortable truths. And while critics dismissed him as inexperienced, the youth of his nation embraced him as proof that their generation could claim the mantle of history. Beyond his borders, Traoré's image began to spread. On social media, Clips of his speeches circulated with captions calling him the new voice of Africa. Young Africans in Ghana, Nigeria, Mali, and Senegal shared his words as rallying cries against corruption, exploitation, and neo-colonial arrogance. His military cap, his calm gaze, his deliberate tone, they became symbols of defiance. Here was a leader who spoke not for applause, but for principle. And in a world where too many leaders bowed to foreign interests, Traoré's insistence on sovereignty made him a beacon of pride. It was this global resonance that made his eventual clash with Trump so symbolic, because Trump, for all his wealth and bluster, represented a different kind of power, loud, domineering, dismissive. Traoré, by contrast, embodied quiet strength. He did not need to shout to be heard. He did not seek chaos to prove his relevance. His calm was his weapon, his dignity his armor. Against Trump's volatility, he was the perfect foil, the reminder that true power does not roar, it endures. And make no mistake, Traoré's composure was not passivity. It was resistance of the highest order. In every pause before his words, in every steady look, he carried the weight of generations who had been told to bow their heads. He was not simply representing himself. He was carrying the dignity of Burkina Faso, of Africa, of every young person who had been dismissed as powerless. His silence, his calm, his measured tone, each was a rejection of arrogance, a refusal to play the role scripted for him by those who underestimated his nation. What gave his presence even more weight was his youth. In a continent often led by aging elites clinging to power, Traoré stood as an embodiment of change. He was proof that leadership could look different, that it could be shaped by the energy of a generation tired of waiting. His rise reminded young Africans that the future was not something to be inherited from the old guard. It was something to be seized. And so, when Ibrahim Traoré took the stage opposite Trump, it was not just two men facing each other. It was a collision of worlds. On one side, a figure built on spectacle, accustomed to bending others to his will through force of personality. On the other, a young soldier turned leader, carrying the quiet confidence of someone whose authority came not from wealth or bluster, but from sacrifice and principle. The world may not have known it then, but this was more than an interview or a debate. It was a confrontation between arrogance and dignity, between the weight of old hierarchies and the rising voice of a new generation. And while Trump came armed with insults, Traoré came armed with something stronger, composure that could not be rattled. So when the stage was set for their live confrontation, the contrast could not have been sharper. The lights of the studio seemed hotter than ever, amplifying the tension in the room. What had begun as a formal exchange quickly unraveled into a battle of tone, patience, and presence. Trump, seated across from Ibrahim Traoré, leaned forward with that familiar scowl, his hands chopping the air as though force alone could dominate the conversation. Every sentence he hurled came faster, louder, meant to cut down, to belittle. He spoke not only to Traoré, but to the cameras, the crowd, the echo chamber he had relied on for years. Traoré, by contrast, remained still, his shoulders relaxed, his hands folded neatly before him, his expression unreadable. He was listening, not cowering. That distinction did not go unnoticed by the audience. Where many of Trump's past opponents had fidgeted or barked back to match his energy, Traoré seemed rooted, as though no gust of insult could shake him. But Trump pressed harder. He called into question the legitimacy of African leaders, throwing out barbed remarks about corruption and instability. He smirked as he mocked the very idea of a young soldier thinking he could command respect on the global stage. His voice rose, and with it, so did the gasps from sections of the audience. Some shifted uncomfortably, others shook their heads, but Trump thrived on spectacle. He mistook noise for dominance. Each interruption became sharper, each dismissal more cutting. He rolled his eyes, waved his hands dismissively, and even leaned back with a laugh meant to mock the seriousness with which Traoré carried himself. The spectacle grew more chaotic, like a storm gathering strength. Moderators tried to intervene, urging both men to keep their remarks within bounds, but Trump bulldozed through. Still, Traoré did not take the bait. His silence was heavier than any insult. His calm was unnerving because it left Trump shouting into a void that refused to give him the satisfaction of reaction. The cameras caught it. The contrast of a man fighting to keep his composure against another who never lost it. The crowd began to notice too. The early chuckles at Trump's jabs faded into murmurs of disapproval. There was a shifting in the energy of the room, a recognition that something deeper was unfolding. The insults were not merely political. They were cultural, personal, cutting against histories of dignity and struggle. And the more Trump pushed, the more the anticipation grew. When would Traoré finally answer? Trump, frustrated by the lack of response, escalated further. He interrupted with sweeping generalizations, pointed his finger across the stage, even mocked Traoré's accent. The audacity of it hung heavy in the air. The audience gasped, then fell into a strained silence. The line had been crossed, and everyone knew it. The camera zoomed in on Traoré's face. Unmoved, his eyes steady, his jaw set, his presence radiating quiet control. He did not need to raise his voice. His very refusal to crumble made Trump look smaller by comparison, like a man shouting at a mountain that would not echo his rage back. And yet, as the seconds stretched, the tension became unbearable. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, feeling the weight of what was about to come. In studios, in living rooms, in cafes across Africa and beyond, people watched, waiting, holding their breath. Trump had always relied on chaos to win, but this time his aggression was exposing him, not intimidating his opponent. The moderators exchanged worried glances. The audience sat in a silence, so sharp it was almost a sound in itself. Trump had pushed and pushed and pushed again. Each insult, each interruption, each mocking gesture left the air heavy with anticipation. And then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, Traoré finally shifted. He leaned forward slightly, his composure intact, his eyes locked on Trump. The room seemed to freeze, the silence thickening with expectation. And then, with the world watching, Traoré decided to respond. The studio hung in suspended silence. Every light, every camera, every eye in the room seemed to turn toward Ibrahim Traoré. He did not raise his voice, nor did he rush to fill the air that Trump had flooded with noise and insults. Instead, he allowed the silence to linger, a silence so sharp it cut through the tension like a blade. Trump shifted in his chair, tapping his fingers impatiently, his bravado faltering as he realized he was no longer dictating the tempo. Traoré leaned forward ever so slightly, his face calm, his eyes locked on Trump's. The room seemed to contract around that gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, unshaken, deliberate. "You speak of strength," he began, pausing as though to let the word echo in every corner of the room. "Yet, what strength is it to mock those who stand for their people? What courage is it to belittle nations you have never cared to understand? What power is it to divide instead of unite?" The weight of the words landed instantly. The audience stirred, murmurs rippling across the hall. Trump's face stiffened, his jaw tightening as though he had not expected his target to strike back with such composure. Traoré continued, his cadence steady, each line carrying the gravity of history behind it. "You call us unstable, corrupt, weak. But it was not we who built empires on the backs of the exploited. It was not we who sent armies to topple governments that dared to stand independent. It was not we who shouted about democracy while silencing those who dared to speak the truth." He let that linger, his words sharp, deliberate. Trump fidgeted, his signature smirk beginning to falter, his eyes darting toward the audience, searching for approval that was no longer there. The cameras caught it, the unraveling of a man who thrived on dominance, suddenly stripped of it. Traoré leaned back slightly, his voice never rising, never wavering. "You tell us what Africa is. But Africa knows itself. Africa does not need lectures from those who once carved it into pieces. We do not need insults to remind us of our past. We carry our past in our blood, and it gives us strength." The audience erupted in applause, the sound rolling through the studio like thunder. Commentators in the back row looked at each other wide-eyed, scribbling furiously, already knowing that these words would headline across the globe. Trump attempted to cut in, his voice strained, his gestures sharper than before. "That's not true. Nobody has done more. Nobody respects Africa more than me." But the interruption only made the contrast clearer. His words spilled out in disjointed fragments, lacking the rhythm and confidence that had once been his shield. He stammered, repeated himself, his voice cracking with irritation. Traoré raised a hand ever so slightly. Not to silence, but as though commanding the room's attention back to order. Respect is not claimed, he said quietly. It is earned. And it is earned not by shouting, not by bullying, not by mocking. It is earned by listening, by understanding, by treating others with dignity. The camera zoomed in on Trump's face, flushed, his eyes darting, his mouth opening but failing to land a clear retort. His famous bravado looked suddenly fragile, like a mask slipping under the weight of exposure. Traoré pressed on, each phrase carefully measured. You call yourself a leader of the free world, but a true leader does not fear the rise of others. A true leader celebrates it. A true leader does not see dignity as a threat. A true leader does not confuse arrogance with strength. The room was electric now. Applause surged again, this time accompanied by cheers. Some audience members rose to their feet, unable to contain their emotion. Across television screens worldwide, millions leaned closer, captivated by the image of a young African leader dismantling decades of stereotypes and arrogance in a single composed address. Trump's agitation grew visible. He waved his hands, leaned toward the microphone, repeated talking points about wealth, about military power, about how nobody else could do what I did. But the words fell flat. They sounded hollow against the dignity of Traoré's counterattack. And then came the final blow. Traoré, paused and let the noise settle, delivered a line that would echo across headlines. We are not here to beg. We are not here to be lectured. We are here because the world is changing, and no amount of shouting can stop it. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Trump seemed frozen, his mouth half open, as if caught between another protest and the realization that nothing he said could match the force of what had just been spoken. The audience rose to its feet in waves. The applause became a roar. Commentators whispered that they had just witnessed history. Cameras captured the moment from every angle. Trump's shrinking presence, Traoré's unshaken resolve, the standing ovation that symbolized not just support for one man, but for an entire continent's defiance against decades of dismissal. Trump tried once more to retake control. Fake news. Totally unfair. He doesn't know what he's talking about. His words were swallowed by the noise of the crowd, his voice cracking in frustration, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as though physical force could re-establish dominance. But it was gone. The moment had passed, and the world had seen it. Traoré sat back, his face serene, his hands still folded. He did not bask in the applause, nor did he push further. He had said enough, and that restraint only magnified the power of his words. Dignity had spoken louder than arrogance ever could. Commentators in real time were already calling it the mic drop heard around the world. Social media feeds lit up instantly with clips of the moment, hashtags multiplying by the second. Viewers described chills, goosebumps, a sense that something far larger than a debate had just unfolded. And yet, inside the studio, the tension remained thick. Trump shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly rattled, unable to mask the sting of humiliation. His responses were clumsy, deflections that failed to erase the impression already seared into the audience's memory. The world had witnessed the unmasking of bravado and the rise of a voice that carried the weight of truth. The fallout from that single moment was bigger than anyone could have predicted. The debate might have ended in the studio, but outside its walls, the storm had only just begun. Within minutes of the broadcast, social media lit up like a wildfire. Clips of Traoré's calm yet devastating counterattack spread across timelines with breathtaking speed. Hashtags began trending worldwide. Hashtag dignity over arrogance. Hashtag Traoré truth. Hashtag mic drop moment. On TikTok, teenagers looped the clip of Trump's stunned expression, pairing it with music, captions, and biting commentary. Memes flourished, some playful, some brutal. A viral split screen showing Trump shouting contrasted with Traoré sitting in composed silence. Caption: one makes noise, the other makes history. Twitter, or X as it was now branded, became a battlefield. Supporters of justice, dignity, and African pride rallied behind Traoré, hailing him as a voice of a new generation of leadership. Tweets called a moment the day arrogance met its match, and proof that calm truth can outshine the loudest lies. Young Africans around the globe shared clips with captions like, "He speaks for us all." Meanwhile, Trump's defenders scrambled. Loyal pundits on conservative outlets rushed to frame the exchange as unfair, claiming the moderators were biased, or that Traoré had rehearsed his attack with help from critics of Trump. Others tried to dismiss it altogether. Just another foreign leader trying to get attention. But their defenses rang hollow. Even among Trump supporters, there were murmurs of unease. The optics were undeniable. A former U.S. president, rattled and unraveling under the weight of words delivered with dignity. Mainstream news networks seized the moment, cutting and replaying the confrontation on endless loops. CNN declared it a seismic moment in modern political history. The BBC described it as the clash that transcended borders. Al Jazeera framed it as Africa's young lion standing toe-to-toe with America's old guard. The New York Times ran the headline, "Traoré exposes Trump. Dignity meets bluster on live TV." But it wasn't just about the headlines. Something deeper stirred. On talk shows, commentators from across the spectrum debated the symbolic power of exchange. Some framed it as generational. The cool steadiness of a youthful leader against the chaos of an older, desperate figure clinging to relevance. Others called it cultural. A moment when the global South, often dismissed or patronized, stood eye to eye with Western arrogance and refused to blink. Across Africa, the reaction was electric. In Ouagadougou, crowds gathered in public squares to watch the replay projected on big screens. Cheers erupted every time Traoré's words cut through Trump's bluster. In Lagos, students painted murals celebrating the moment. In Nairobi, activists declared proof that African leaders could command the world stage with pride, without apology. The diaspora amplified it further. African Americans, Caribbean voices, immigrant communities across Europe and the U.S. shared the clip with captions like, "This is a representation we've been waiting for," and "a leader who speaks truth without fear." For many, it wasn't about Burkina Faso alone. It was about a global sense of dignity rising in defiance of decades of dismissal. Meanwhile, Trump's humiliation grew larger by the hour. Late-night comedians pounced, mocking his red-faced stammering and failed comebacks. Satirical skits exaggerated his hand gestures and fragmented protests, contrasting them with Traoré's calm delivery. Even celebrities weighed in. A-list actors, athletes, and musicians shared their admiration for the young African leader. One Grammy-winning rapper tweeted, "That man just schooled the so-called king of clapbacks without even raising his voice." Respect. Yet the shockwaves weren't confined to social media or entertainment. Political analysts began asking serious questions. If this was how Trump performed under international scrutiny, how would he handle negotiations with leaders who would not be intimidated by his bluster? Could the image of him rattled and cornered weaken his hold over supporters who prize him for his supposed strength? And what did it mean that a leader from one of Africa's poorest nations had become the face of global dignity overnight? By the second day, the clip had amassed hundreds of millions of views across platforms. Hashtag spawned movements. Dignity over arrogance turned into a slogan on t-shirts, banners, and protest signs. Commentators declared it not just a political moment, but a cultural one, a turning point in how leadership itself was perceived. For years, Trump had thrived on chaos, on dominating the spotlight, on being the loudest voice in the room. But now, the spotlight was shining elsewhere. It illuminated a young African leader who had not shouted, had not insulted, had not blustered, and yet had stolen the world's attention by embodying the very qualities so many longed to see in leadership: composure, truth, and dignity. And yet, beyond the noise of hashtags, headlines, and viral clips, something deeper was happening. A shift in how millions viewed leadership itself. When the dust finally settled and the noise of pundits and headlines began to fade, one truth remained clear. This was never just about two men locked in a verbal clash. It was bigger than Trump. It was bigger than Traoré. It was about the eternal tension between arrogance and dignity, between noise and truth, between power built on fear and leadership built on respect. For all his bluster, Trump embodied a kind of politics that thrives on division. His power had always come from loudness, from the ability to drown out others with spectacle. But that night, the spectacle failed him. Against the calm presence of Ibrahim Traoré, his outbursts looked less like strength and more like insecurity exposed in real time. The insults that once energized crowds instead hung in the air, flat and unconvincing. His volume no longer carried weight. Traoré, on the other hand, represented something different. He never raised his voice. He never resorted to insult, and yet his presence filled a room. His words, measured, sharp, unflinching, reframed the moment. In the face of Trump's dismissiveness, he reminded the world that dignity is not negotiable, that respect is not optional, that justice will always speak louder than arrogance, no matter how powerful the megaphone of the one trying to silence it. For Africans watching, it was a vindication. Too often their leaders have been caricatured, their nations dismissed, their voices ignored. But here was a young man, not yet 40, standing eye to eye with one of the most polarizing figures on the global stage, and not flinching. He did not plead, he did not bow, he did not soften his truth. Instead, he embodied a leadership that was unashamedly proud, rooted in sacrifice, and unwilling to trade dignity for approval. And for the wider world, it carried a universal message. Leadership is not about wealth or celebrity or bluster. True leadership is about the ability to hold steady in the storm, to carry values that unite rather than words that divide. In Traoré's restraint, viewers found a reminder that calm is not weakness, that truth does not need to shout, that respect can win battles arrogance will always lose. That is why the clip resonated so deeply, far beyond Africa, far beyond American politics. It tapped into something human, the hunger for leaders who reflect the best in us, not the worst. The longing for voices that heal rather than wound, that build bridges rather than walls. For many, Traoré became more than a politician in that moment. He became a symbol of what leadership could look like if dignity, unity, and justice were placed at the center. And yet, perhaps the most powerful lesson was this. Traoré did not win a moment because he had more power. He won it because he refused to surrender his values. He showed that dignity is not dependent on status or wealth. It is a choice made in the face of insult to stand tall. That night, the world saw arrogance shaken by truth. They saw a bluster collapse under the weight of dignity. And they were reminded, whether in politics, in leadership, or in life, that the loudest voice is not always the strongest, and the strongest voice is not always the loudest. And that brings us back to you, because this moment wasn't just theirs, it's ours. Trump lost it. Ibrahim Traoré exposed the truth, and the world saw the contrast laid bare, arrogance collapsing under its own weight, dignity standing tall without raising its voice. This wasn't just a viral clash caught on camera. It was a reminder of what real leadership looks like. For years, Trump thrived on noise, on the spectacle of dominance, on the illusion that power belongs to those who shout the loudest. But in that live moment, it became painfully clear. Noise fades, bluster breaks, arrogance crumbles. What endures is the leader who carries truth with calm and conviction. Traoré didn't just win the exchange. He embodied a principle larger than himself, that respect, justice, and dignity will always outlast fear, insult, and arrogance. And that's why this story matters beyond politics, beyond nations, beyond one stage. Because it calls us to remember what kind of leadership we deserve, and what kind of leadership we should demand. So if you believe in leaders who stand for truth, if you believe dignity matters more than arrogance, if you believe calm courage can silence the loudest insults, then don't just watch the story. Be part of the movement. Subscribe, share this video, and add your voice to a community that believes leadership should lift people up, not tear them down. And I'll leave you with this. History doesn't remember the loudest voices. It remembers the truth.